Hi and welcome to the Skeptic Show. Today I have a very special guest. इनका नाम है भार्गव जोशी एंड ये फाउंडर एंड एडिटर एट प्रोजेक्ट सत्यलोक हैं. अगर आपको हिंदुइज्म के बारे में या हिंदू माइथोलॉजी के बारे में या बुद्धिज्म के बारे में भी अगर आपको एकेडमिक स्टडी चाहिए बहुत ही सिंपल फॉर्मेट में, तो आप प्रोजेक्ट सत्यलोक पे जा सकते हैं. ये टीचिंग असिस्टेंट हैं, डिपार्टमेंट है इनका रिलीजियस स्टडी एट यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ कैलिफोर्निया डेविस. भार्गव, आपको आपका यहाँ पे बहुत बहुत स्वागत है और आपको अपने बारे में किसी को कुछ बताना चाहेंगे तो नाउ इज द टाइम.
Okay, thank you. Yes, my name is Bhargav Joshi. By profession, I'm a mechanical engineer and I'm a graduate student at University of California, Davis, Master of Science in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. But along with that, I'm also working part-time as a graduate teaching assistant in the Department of Religious Studies. So as a part of this role, I have to take discussions on various topics of religious studies, like, for example, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Abrahamic faith, Greece culture, Native American, African diasporic, many things, many things. So that's basically what my role is as a teaching assistant. And regarding Project Satyalok, so the very fundamental reason you could say that I started this project is because in India right now, there is kind of a dichotomy. So there is a left wing, there is a right wing, but unfortunately, people do not have the accurate knowledge about Hinduism, about Jainism, Buddhism, basically about Indian culture. So our project is not focused on Hinduism. It is focused on reviving the Indic culture. So that's why it is more of an Indological study and not Hinduism. Like it is not Hinduism, it is an Indological study of ancient India. That's what Indology is. So that's what the channel is about. Yeah. And for now, it's going pretty great. We have 6,000 followers right now, and we are getting really good response in our posts. We have also made documentaries kind of thing. You could call them videos. So yeah, it's there are many fields that we are trying to discover as a part of this project.
एंड यू आर डूइंग अ वंडरफुल जॉब. मैं खुद आपके वीडियोस से अगर मुझे एकेडमिक स्टडी चाहिए होता है तो जाकर के पेपर्स पढ़ना बहुत ज़्यादा टाइम कंज्यूमिंग होता है फॉर मेरे लिए, तो बहुत ज़्यादा, क्योंकि मैं बीसीए कर रहा हूँ तो मेरा डिपार्टमेंट ही अलग है, मैं टेक्निकल फील्ड से हूँ. तो वहाँ पे पेपर्स पढ़ना, बुक्स पढ़ना और फिर कंज्यूम करके छोटा छोटा नोट्स बनाना ऑलमोस्ट इम्पॉसिबल है. सो आपके वीडियोस, आपका वर्क बहुत ज़्यादा हेल्पफुल है. मैं ये डिस्कशन बिगिन करना चाहूँगा वैदिक रिलीजन से, क्योंकि अभी भी आप देखते हो कि वैदिक रिलीजन बहुत ज्यादा डिबेट्स में, बहुत ज्यादा डिस्कशन में इन्वोक किया जाता है. सो व्हाट वाज दिस वैदिक रिलीजन?
Okay, that's a fantastic question to begin with. To go into this, we first need to understand how Hinduism as a religion, you could say, a polytheistic slash monotheistic religion began. So when you talk about Vedic religion, we are trying to distinguish between the Vedic literature or the culture as described in the Vedas with the Dharma Shastra tradition, which evolved much later. So to begin with, the Vedas are considered to be the foundation of Sanatan Dharma or Hinduism. However, the Vedas themselves don't call them Shruti, or they themselves don't call Apaurushaya. So we often hear that the Vedas are Apaurushaya or they are Shrota, which means they are heard. They are not created by anyone, they were heard by the sages of ancient India, and they were narrated by the creator Prajapati, sometimes referred to as Brahma. But that is not really the case because that's what Purva Mimamsa says about the Vedic literature. Vedas themselves don't call them as Shruti or they don't call themselves as Apaurushaya. They are very much human. They are basically poetry. That is what the Vedas are. And you could say the ethos or the essence of Vedas is to try to put all of nature in the poetic form. And that is one of the ingenious forms of poetry that I've come across. I've read the Poetics of Aristotle. I've read many other cultures, poetry from Wintu, and I found that the Vedic poetry is just profound. That is my personal opinion, of course. And as we proceed, so we have the Vedas as the foundation, the Vedic literature, which has Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Upanishads, finally Vedanta. You could say this is the foundation on which Sanatan Dharma is built upon. And then we get to the later additions, or you could say the later treatises, which were developed much later than the Vedic era, and we enter the realm of Dharma Sutras. So right now we have the four Dharma Sutras, which are still extant in the textual form, and the Dharma Sutras are basically written by Apastamba, then Baudhayana, and then we have Gautama and the fourth one, which I don't recall at the moment. But these are the Dharma Sutras. And then steadily and gradually, they evolved into the Dharma Shastras, which is what we refer to as Hinduism today. And that is highly orthodox, you could say. It is very structured as a religion. And you could say Hinduism from the Dharma Shastric tradition, that is definitely a religion. It fits into the Abrahamic faith. But the early Vedic literature, the entire Vedic corpus, and kind of um, post-Vedic corpus, like Upanishads or the later texts, they do not exactly fit the religious definition. But Dharma Shastras definitely do. So what are Dharma Shastras? So we have what we call as Smriti, something which is memorized. So those are the Manu Smriti, the Vishnu Smriti, the Parashara Smriti, the Yajnavalkya Smriti, and the Narada Smriti. So these are some of the Smritis. Manu Smriti comes earlier, and then we have the other Smritis following Manu Smriti. Manu Smriti is partially filled with unjust laws, and it is also filled with contradictory definitions. So that is the reason why it is condemned by many of the people, as we see historically. But yeah, basically, Dharma Shastras is what you would call the orthodox Hinduism or the system where the Hinduism became orthodox. Vedic literature was really fluid. So that is basically the distinction between the Vedic religion and the Dharma Shastras. And then we get to the Puranic literature, then we have the other forms of Itihasa or Mahakavya, like the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. So they again were written much later, and they do not form a part of Vedic literature, they were written much later. So these are all a part of Puranic literature or post-Vedic literature. And you could spot the difference linguistically, you could spot the difference philologically in that. So that is why they are separate. Vedic religion is separate because Vedic religion and the deities in Vedic religion are way different. When I say way different, the representation of those deities is really different than what we see in the Puranas. So this is how you would distinguish between the Vedic religion and the Dharma Shastric tradition, which is today accepted as Hinduism. So that would be my opinion on the subject.
You talked about the beauty of poetry in the Vedas. What was the
Mhm.
nature of that poetry? वहाँ पे क्या क्या बात कर रहे थे?
Yes, so that is a really good question. So to begin that, I would like to place a really interesting thing here. So just forget everything I said. Just focus on one thing. Mandala 1 of Rigveda. It begins with the word Agni. So when I say the word Agni, or when you think about it, what exactly crosses your mind when you are looking at fire? What exactly crosses your mind? What would you think about it?
Food,
Like when you're looking at fire.
food and purity, because I have read और मेरे दिमाग से वो निकलेगा नहीं तो purity, food
That's true.
and
But
mm,
you can agree that you definitely think about something. So
yeah.
when you look at the fire, it kind of induces a thought in you. It is a thought-provoking action,
Hmm.
right? But when I asked you the question, you yourself admit that it is quite difficult to articulate that. It is difficult to put that thought into words, right? That is exactly what Rigveda does. So that poetry is to put the thoughts that you have in your mind in the form of words to articulate those thoughts. That is exactly what the Vedic poetry is. It is the study of nature in an observational and a poetic form, and it is beautiful. Like, for example, when I say Agni, in Rigveda, Agni is viewed not just as an elemental deity, but it is also a symbol of consciousness. It represents consciousness. And there is, you could say, a relation between Agni and Soma. So, for example, there is a story in Rigveda, rather, it is in the Upanishad, Upanishad. And the story is about Prajapati. So Prajapati is considered to be the creator. The names are fluid. So Prajapati, Brahma, they represent the same entity. So Prajapati, when he created the universe, he created Agni from his mouth. And that is the reason why Agni himself is the devourer of everything. Agni devours everything. And what happened was when Agni was created, he rushed to eat Prajapati himself. So Prajapati was terrified. And so he created Soma to satisfy Agni. So Vedas display this constant tradition of Agni eating the Soma. or Agni drinking the soma, if you consider soma as a liquid substance. But this very act of the eater and the eaten, that is what defines the subjective and the objective existence. And that is filled, the Vedas are filled with metaphors. They are filled with all the comparisons between objects that we see in nature. So Vedic poetry is, you could say, linguistically, it is absolute. I mean, imagine in 2000 BC, you have to pass down something to the next generation in an oral form, in verbal transmission. And that is very challenging. Because, for example, when I say this, and 1 hour later, my students who were hearing this lecture, they would not remember 100% of it, right? They are definitely going to forget something. But then, how do you pass on something ensuring that all of it is passed down? There is nothing missing. There are no manipulations. There is no addition. There is no subtraction. And that is where we get the system of Partha. So that is how the Vedic poetry was passed down. But linguistically, it is absolute, and basically, it is a poem. The entire Rig Veda is a grand poem of the elements of nature. So that is what Vedic poetry is. It is profound. It is pregnant with ontological explanations for the universe. It is very good. And I believe that every academic and every religious person should at least read the Rig Veda once, academically, logically, and maybe by their own faith. But they should read that at least once. That is my opinion.
या वेदास बहुत ही लंबे टाइम तक लिखा गया था, एटलीस्ट ये मुझे पता चला जब मैं इसके बारे में पढ़ रहा था। आरण्यकास बहुत पहले आए थे और उपनिषद लास्ट में, सबसे लास्ट में ऐड किया गया था। तो इसके बारे में थोड़ा बताइए कि ये जो इवोल्यूशन हुआ है थॉट का, क्योंकि आपके पास एक बैटल ऑफ टेन किंग है, वहां पे विश्वामित्र को जॉब से निकाल दिया जाता है क्योंकि वो ठीक से प्रेयर्स नहीं कर रहे हैं, एंड देन यू रीच मंडल 10 जहाँ पे नासिद सुक्ता में आप गॉड को ही क्वेश्चन कर रहे हो कि क्या वो ओमनी प्रेजेंस है या क्या ओमनी पोटेंस को ही आप क्वेश्चन कर रहे हो। तो ये इवोल्यूशन के बारे में थोड़ा बताइए, और वेदास के जो जो पार्ट हैं, शायद 4 पार्ट्स हैं, संहिता, आरण्यकास, एंड देन समथिंग, एंड देन द उपनिषद, तो इनसे इनके बारे में कुछ बताइए।
Yes, thank you. So basically, Rig Veda is divided into 10 mandalas, and the mandala first and the 10th were later additions because both of them have exactly 191 hymns. So that's not by chance, that's by design. So they're linguistically, they come in a later era. So actual Vedic composition, that is simply the second mandala up to the seventh mandala. These are the core of Rig Veda. And when you move to the eighth mandala, it is based on the altercations of the earlier books, earlier mandalas. And the ninth mandala is basically like a compilation of everything that was covered in the first 6 to 7 mandalas. And then we get to the 10th mandala, and the 10th book. So when I say mandala, you can call them as books, you could call them as treatises. I prefer to call them as books. So in the 10th book, mandala 10, we have the various suttas. Purusha Sukta is one of them, where we find a reference to the Varna system. But again, saying that it was added later, because from mandala 2 to mandala 7, we do not find any significant references to the Varna system. Rather, we do not find any references whatsoever. Now, mandala 10 is a later addition, and we could trace that linguistically. And there are certain verses in mandala 10 which are written in later metrical units. So Vedas are written in chandas. For example, allow me to quote a Sanskrit verse. The verse goes like Gayatrishna Ganushtub, Rati Panktitrishhtub, Jagatas Chandansi. So in this, you have the 7 chandas, Gayatri, Ushni, Anushtup, Ruhati, Pankti, Trishtup, and Jagati. So these are the 7 fundamental chandas in which Rig Veda or any other Vedic literature is written. And these are actually meters, what you call in linguistics or in prosody as meters. Every meter has a character limit. Just as we enter password and it says that you have 8 characters. So you have to enter 8 characters in that password box. Similarly, these meters or the chandas, they were characters. They were character boxes. For example, Gayatri. So Gayatri has a limit of 24 characters. So when you say that something is written in the Gayatri Chanda, it should have exactly 24 characters. Now, Gayatri Mantra is written in Gayatri Mantra. So if you count the syllables in Gayatri Mantra, they are exactly 24. So if they are more than 24, it means there has been some manipulation. And likewise, if they are less than 24, it means there has been some manipulation. So you see, this is really ingenious form of preserving the knowledge by protecting it. So this is how the Vedas were written in meters. And so most of them, the earlier mandalas are written in Gayatri meter, which means the verses have 24 syllables. So after 24 syllables, it goes to the next verse. So that is how they are written. So for example, if you find that mandala 2 is written in Gayatri and suddenly you find a verse which is written in Jagati. Jagati is a later chanda. It was not present when Gayatri evolved. So you would say that, okay, what is this chanda doing here? Why is this verse written in Jagati chanda? Jagati has a character limit. I'm not sure right now, but it is way more than 24 characters. So that makes you question that, okay, is this really of the same era, or was this added later? So this kind of invokes a thought in you linguistically, and this you can definitely pursue as a linguistic study of the Vedas. So this is all about the philology of the Vedic literature. Now about the divisions. So Vedas were basically later. Uh, the Vedas were written in the textual format around 1000 BCE, you could say, during the Kuru Rashtra and during the Bharata tribe. So when the Bharata tribe gained hegemony over the entire subcontinent, that is when they decided to put the Vedas into a textual form. And then the Kuru Rashtra kind of compiled all of them. And Vedas were transmitted by schools, which are called as Shakha. And there are four types of Shaka: Shakala, Bashkala, Ashvalayani, and right now I remember three of them. There's a fourth of them. But these were the Vedic schools which transmitted the Vedic knowledge. And later, of course, it was transmitted in the form of, rather in the written form. So when they were written in the form of text, that is when you have to keep the syntax intact. So if you see a verse in the Vedic literature, it has horizontal lines below the letter and it has vertical lines above the letter. And you have to sing it in exactly the same form as it is displayed. So, for example, if you take a verse for at the moment, I remember, for example, Shanno Devirabhishtaya Po Bhavantu Pitaye Shanyora Vistravantunaha. So when I say this, these are tonally accented verses. And there is a reason why I went in higher tone and I went in the lower tone. Uh, and it should be sung in this exact fashion. And if you don't do that, then your teacher is going to hit you and he's going to force you to follow that method because if you mess this up, you're going to change the meaning. So that's why it is pivotal that you do not change the tonations and the accent of pronouncing the way. And then
This rule
coming
is
to
still
the
followed. ये rule तो भी follow
uh,
करते हैं.
yes, so it is still followed. So if you have learned Paurohitya, which I have in my earlier years, so yes, it is still followed and it is still followed from north to southern India. It's the same uniform system of reciting the Vedas. And that's why UNESCO actually awarded the Vedic transmission system as the intangible human heritage. And that is wonderful. They appreciated and they acknowledged that Vedas are one of the most absolute forms of oral transmission. So that is, I'd say that is fantastic.
Yeah.
Yes, and now we're getting to your question about Samhitas, Aranyakas, Upanishads, Brahmanas. So yes, the word Aranyaka literally means forest. So these texts were to be recited, or you could say narrated, when you were in the forest. You were living as a Pravarjita, which is a later word, but basically when you're living as a sage in the forests. Those were Aranyaka. Brahmanas came before that, and Samhitas are basically the collections of Rigveda. So that is what the Samhitas are, Rigvedic Samhitas. It later evolved into Brahmanas. So we see a shift from poetry, which is basically offered as, you could say, stuti of gods, of Vedic gods. That is what the Samhitas are. But when you shift from Samhitas to Brahmanas or Aranyakas or even Upanishads, we shift to the ontological speculation of nature. So in the Upanishads, you would find all sorts of questions like, how does all of this come into existence? What was there at the time of the creation? So it says in the Chandogya Upanishad, that in the beginning there was neither existence nor there was non-existence, and then there was only Brahmana. So in this case, Brahmana is not a Varna, it is the ultimate reality, something that encompasses everything. And from Brahmana, it slowly manifested into Prakriti. So Brahmana is sometimes also referred to as Purusha. So Purusha can cognize his identity, but he is not conscious of anything. So in order to be aware of what he is, he manifests himself in Prakriti, that is matter. So Purusha, as a baseline, you could call that roughly as consciousness, while Prakriti would be matter. So yeah, so Upanishads are filled with all sorts of these things. They are ontological, they are philosophical speculations, and they shift from simply poems to ideas, to philosophies. So that is where we see the shift, even in the Vedic literature itself. So that is how they were composed. So, and Samhitas are basically collections. And we have, I don't remember the exact number of Samhitas right now, but yeah, so this is how the matter progressed. Samhitas to Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Upanishads. That is how they are divided. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and वैदिक गॉड्स और उपनिषद में जो गॉड का डिस्क्रिप्शन है उसमें बहुत ज़्यादा डिफरेंस आ रहा है, क्योंकि वैदिक गॉड्स में आपको अग्नि है, वरुण है, इंद्र है, एंड देन यू रीच उपनिषद और वहाँ पे फिर आप सिर्फ क्वेश्चन कर रहे हो ये है क्या, व्हाट इज दिस, व्हाट इज द नेचर ऑफ रियलिटी. सो ये शिफ्ट, क्या ये थॉट्स का इवोल्यूशन है और इसके लिए सोसाइटी का स्टेबल होना भी बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट होगा?
Yes, yes, that's true. So when you look at the Vedic poetry, like the Rig Veda itself, the foundation of the Vedic literature. So in that, you see that offerings or sacrifices are for all the elemental deities. We have Indra, we have Agni, Mitra, Varuna, Usha, which is dawn, the goddess of dawn, and then we have Aditi, Diti, then we have Adityas, all sorts of people. And then we define a common term in Rig Veda as Vishwedeva, which means if any of the devas has been left behind, he's included in this. So that's Vishvedeva. Rather, it also comes in Rigvedic Sandhya. So if you take a look at that, Vedas talk about families of poets which have composed the Rigveda. So for example, in the Rigvediya Sandhya, it says, Saptanam Vyaratinam Vishwamitra Jamadagani Bharadavaja Gautamatri Vashishta Kashyapa Rishayah. And then it moves on to describe the gods. So in that it says Agnir Vayuvadityo Bruhaspatir Varunendro Vishwe Deva Devataha. So this describes all the gods that are there in Vedas. And then it concludes by saying Vishwe Deva Devata. So all the gods that are not included in this are included in Vishwe Deva. So yeah, that's kind of unfair to other gods, but that's how it is. And then we see that all of these are elemental, even though they have some sort of personified existence, which tries to relate the elements of nature to humans. How do we perceive these elements of nature? So, for example, when you say Agni, as I mentioned earlier, what exactly is Agni to humans? But at foundation, they are basically invitations to the god. Rigveda is filled with inviting the deities to their homa or yajna. So those are all invitations. And basically, the sacrificial practices or the ritualistic methods in Rigveda, they were like, okay, I have so many poems for you. So if you find these poems, please come to our homa or please come to our yajna. That is what the Rigveda is. So the more creative your poem is, higher the probability that Indra will come to your yajna and not go to anywhere else. So that is what Rigveda is. So they are very, you could say, ritualistic. But then in the Upanishads, as you mentioned, we see a drastic change. And that change is, of course, philosophical. So in Upanishad, we don't really have the concept of creationism as we find in the Abrahamic faiths like Christianity or Islam, where we have the concept of a creator and he creates the entire universe. We don't have that in Upanishads. Rather, Upanishads do not talk about Ishvara, which is what we would recognize as the monotheistic creator. No, it does not talk about that. Upanishads refer continuously, for example, the Brihadaranyaka or the Chandogya Upanishad. It talks about an entity called as Brahmana or the Purusha. And Brahmana is not understood as the creator, not at all. He's not responsible for creation. Rather, Brahmana is a part of creation, and while doing that, he is the creation itself. But there's no origin to Brahmana. So there's a particular story. There are many stories in Chandogya, but there's a particular story of, I guess, Shandilya, or I'm not sure about the sage right now, but there's a story where a student visits the ashrama of the Vedic seer, and he says, I want to learn about Brahma. Can you please teach me about Brahma? So the Vedic sage replies, oh, yeah, sure. So what you can do is go there and bring me that fruit. That is um, I guess the name of the fruit is Nigrayodha, but I'll get to that. I'll verify that. But the Vedic sage says, okay, bring me that fruit. I'll teach you about Brahmana. So the student goes, he brings that fruit, and then the Vedic sage says, okay, now I want you to unpack the fruit, open the fruit, cut it down, and take the seed and cut down the seed. So the student does that. He cuts the fruit, he takes the seed from the fruit, and he tries to crush the seed to see what's within the seed. And then he comes back to his teacher, and he asks the teacher, "Teacher, here it is. Here are the divisions of the seed. How do I find Brahmana, or how do I find Atman?" So the sage replies, "The essence when you cut the seed, something that you do not see in this, that is Brahman." So that is how the Upanishads try to use analogies, or they try to use metaphors to explain the concept of Brahman. And it is repetitive. There are many stories. And in fact, there is one story about Indra as a god, as an elemental deity, and Virochana, which is a demon actually. Not demon, but you could say anti-god, anti-elemental deity. So these two go to visit Prajapati. And Indra and Virochana say that both of us want to learn about the self, about the Atmana. What is Atmana? So Prajapati replies, when you look into the mirror, what you see is the Atman. Or when you look into your reflection in the water, when you see that, that is Atman, that is the self. And so Indra and Virochana are happy because they know what Atmana is. So they just go along their ways. However, Indra starts thinking. He says, wait a minute. So if my body is blind, does that mean my Atmana is blind? And then Indra starts thinking about it, that no, this is not a good definition. I need to go back. But Virochana is satisfied with that definition, with the materialistic definition. He says that okay, all I have to do is worship my body. Okay, so I'm satisfied with that. And that is why he remains a demon. But Indra is more intuitive. He tries to learn more, so he goes back. And he says, Prajapati, I'm not satisfied with your answer. I don't think body is the self. Body is not the self. So Prajapati he's actually quite surprised and is impressed that, oh, wow, so we are finally getting to that. So Prajapati says that, yes, that's true. It is your consciousness. It is what you have when you are in deep sleep. That state of deep sleep, that is what Brahmana is. And that is what Atmana is. So now Indra goes back and he tries to cogitate on that. And he thinks about that. And slowly and steadily, he realizes the self or the Atmana. And that is why he becomes a god. And Virochana stays a demon. He's attached to the material things. He's attached to the body. He does not try to develop a deeper understanding. And this story is there in the Chandogya Upanishad. So it's a very fantastic story which shows us the distinction about what makes someone a god and what makes someone a demon. And how do you distinguish? And you see that all these people, humans, gods, and people from all social strata, they are trying to learn the same thing. What is the self? So yes, definitely, Upanishads do talk about philosophically about the whole, the concept of the whole. They do not refer to a creator. So yes, that I know I took quite a long time to answer that, but that is in essence the answer to your question.
आई फील बैड फॉर इंद्र, उनको पता नहीं था कि उनके साथ क्या होने वाला है आगे. From a god,
Exactly.
from a god to basically losing every battle.
Yes, exactly. If you try, I would like to expand on that, because if you try to take a look at the Vedic poetry, Indra is actually one of the most important deities.
Yeah.
And Vishnu, the concept of Trinity, it is not present in the Vedic literature. It evolved in the Puranic literature, where suddenly we see a shift to the concept of Trinity, the concept of creation, preservation, destruction. That is there in Puranas. It is not there in Vedic literature. And in fact, Indra is superior to many other deities. And next in line would be Agni. And Agni has the maximum number of verses in the Vedic literature, and then followed by Indra. But Agni has the maximum. So yes, as you said, it's quite true that Indra is revered as the Almighty God, Almighty elemental deity in the Vedic literature. But when we get to the Puranic literature, we see the sudden rise of the concept of Trinity, and we have Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, or Shiva, and Indra is somehow inferior to them. So yes, this concept is also quite interesting to investigate the difference between the Puranic thought and the Vedic thought. This is how it evolved. So yes, that's true.
एंड वेदास में विष्णु पे सिर्फ 7 या 3, आई थिंक 7, सिर्फ 7 श्लोक हैं, एंड देन विष्णु बिकम्स अ मेजर गॉड जो कि इंद्र को हर बार हेल्प करते हैं. आई वाज रीडिंग हरिवंश ट्रांसलेशन, विवेक देबरॉय का था शायद, एंड
Mhm.
उसमें इंद्र और कृष्ण के बीच में फाइट हो रहा है, एंड इंद्र
Mhm.
लूज कर रहा है वो बैटल. सो बेसिकली ये शिफ्ट हुआ कि वो इंद्र ऑलमाइटी गॉड, क्योंकि वेदास में भी इंद्र इज वेरी पावरफुल, एंड महाभारत में जो कि वैदिक लिटरेचर का पार्ट है उसमें भी इंद्र इज वेरी पावरफुल. बट देन वो
Yes. Yeah.
बट
Oh, sorry.
बट देन वो धीरे धीरे पावर लूज करते जा रहा है, और यहाँ तक कि आज कोई इंद्र को वर्शिप भी नहीं करता, बस छोटे छोटे जगहों में कहीं कहीं पे वर्शिप किया जाता है. सो आई रियली वांट टू टॉक अबाउट द एपिक्स, द इतिहास, महाभारत एंड द रामायण.
Mhm.
इन दोनों में से पहले कौन
Right.
लिखा गया था? क्योंकि वैदिक लिटरेचर में ये दोनों बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है, और महाभारत वैदिक टेक्स्ट में लिखा गया है, और रामायण क्लासिकल संस्कृत में. एंड क्लासिकल संस्कृत ग्रामर, पन्नी के ग्रामर को ये कोडिफाई करने के बाद लिखा गया था. सो महाभारत पहले लिखा गया है एंड रामायण उसके बाद लिखा गया है. बट रामायण का जो इवेंट है वो पहले का है और स्टोरी के हिसाब से, एंड देन महाभारत का इवेंट रामायण के बाद का है. बट मुझे यहाँ पे क्वेश्चन ये है कि ये तो मैं समझ गया क्योंकि दोनों का लैंग्वेज अलग है और वैदिक लैंग्वेज पुराना है क्लासिकल संस्कृत से. बट महाभारत में भी राम का स्टोरी है. सो क्या इसका मतलब ये हुआ कि राम का स्टोरी रामायण, वाल्मीकि के रामायण लिखे जाने से पहले एग्जिस्ट करता था, या फिर वो लेटर एडिशन है?
Okay, that's a really good question. So, if you think about it simply chronologically, but that is considering the textual chronology, not the actual chronology. In the textual chronology, yes, Ramayana does come before Mahabharata, but Mahabharata is more complex as an epic. That is, of course, partially because of the reasons that you mentioned, the linguistic base of Mahabharata. It is divided. So, if you take a look at what the Western academia says about Mahabharata, it says that initially it was written by Vyasa. Vyasa is, by the way, a title. It is not pertaining to a single entity. It is a title. The compiler of the Vedic literature, that is Vyas. So it was written by Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa, as Mahabharata itself recognizes that. But when it was written, it was called as Jaya. This is all, by the way, a speculation from Western academia, which is still agreed upon even by most of the major institutes in India. And if you want, you could read the critical edition of Mahabharata, which is composed and compiled by Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. That is a really fantastic read, and it is highly authentic. Yes, so coming back to Mahabharata, it says that initially, when Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa wrote it, it was called Jaya, and it has only 8,800 verses. It had only 8,800 verses. And it is simply the narrative of the Kurukshetra war. It does not give any other details about the lineage or about all the other kinds of things that are there in Mahabharata. It is simply a war narrative. That is all it is. The Kurukshetra war narrative. That is
सो
what
सो
Vyasa
सो सो
wrote.
सो ओनली द रफ आइडिया कि यहाँ पे कृष्ण है एंड देन अर्जुन है, एंड बीच में वो डाइस का गेम होता है, एंड देन वॉर होता है, एंड देन दैट्स द एंड, बस इतना
Yes.
ही.
Yes, so it's more compact than that. It starts from the first thing, but the verses are very compact. So it does not build upon the stories. It just gives what is required. It just has 8,800 verses. It had 8,800 verses. So that was written by, of course, Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa. This was called the Jaya, which is victory.
Hmm.
So it is basically a war narrative. And later, the Jaya transformed as it was passed down by the disciples and the students of Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa, like we have Ugrashrava Sauti and Janmejaya and many other people. So then it got transformed to Bharata. The name of the epic became Bharata because all the tribes of Bharata participated. And then, because of multiple additions to the text, it suddenly had 24,000 verses. So initially it had 8,000 verses approximately in the Jaya. Bharata has 24,000 verses, thrice of the initial record. And then with the later additions, the later passage of time, Mahabharata has 100,000 verses, which is existing today as what we call as Mahabharata. So it has 100,000 verses. So you see a huge amount of manipulation, or not manipulation, additions have been made to the text from Jaya to Mahabharata. And this idea is believed by majority of the academia in Indology. However, if you read the Mahabharata or the commentary on Mahabharata by Sukthankar, which is again, he was a scholar from Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. So he says that no, actually, Jaya itself had 100,000 verses. It did not have just 8,000. It had 100,000 verses to begin with. But then there is always there are academic conflicts between these topics, and so it becomes difficult to determine that. So that is partially the reason why some of the aspects of Mahabharata predate the Ramayana linguistically, but later additions are actually after the Ramayana. And now coming to Ramayana. So Ramayana is again a didactic, Mahabharata and Ramayana are didactic tales. They are epics. They might be based on real events, which we today refer to as a historical narrative or a retelling of history. So they might be based on real events, and there might have been a king called Ramachandra, there might have been a king called Krishna, but we are not sure if what the texts say is exactly how it was in the past. So they are a derivative of the historical events. They might be based on history, but that does not mean that they are historical accounts. They are retellings. They are, again, they are epics. They are didactic. They are pedagogical. They are meant to pass on values. They are not historical records. The difference between history and epic is that history simply has information. It has no pedagogical elements. It is simply information. Retellings or narratives, they are filled with didactic tales, and they are filled with pedagogical values like morality, compassion, um, justice. What do we call justice? Dharma, as is repeatedly said in Ramayana. And these could be parallel to the Greek epics. Like, for example, we have the Iliad and Odyssey in Greek. They are also epics. And they again pass on the values, moral values, which we can learn from the epic. So, regarding your question, the reason why this is because, as I explained earlier, that Jaya to Mahabharata, the evolution from Jaya to Mahabharata, linguistically, and also you could say in the form of mythos of the story. So there are four elements: mythos, ethos, catharsis, phronesis, and all of this is a part of mimesis. So these are, we can get to that later. But that is the reason why we are still not sure about which epic came before and which came later. And there are still disputes about that. But linguistically, a part of Mahabharata predates the Ramayana, text of Ramayana, but chronologically, of course, if you go by the tales, Ramayana comes before, Mahabharata comes later, and Ramayana happened before, Mahabharata happened later. But that is, of course, what the stories say. Linguistically speaking, yes, there are certain parts in Mahabharata which predate the linguistics of Ramayana. But then we are not sure if that relates to the chronology of the actual events. So that would be my answer, and that is, of course, from my reading. But again, there are many disputes in the academic community about this as well. So yeah.
सो महाभारत में जो राम की स्टोरी है वो लेटर एडिशन हो सकता है.
Yes, definitely. It could be a later edition. Definitely.
और मैं बात करना चाहूँगा कृष्ण द्वापन्य वेद व्यास के बारे में. वेद व्यास एक टाइटल है, ये तो मुझे पता है. बट जया को जो कंपोज करा वो वेद व्यास, वो जो पर्सन है वेद व्यास, और जो वेदास को जो कंपाइल किया, आर दी सेम?
No. So, yes. So, when you refer to the term Vyas, it loosely is related to the compiler of the Vedas. But Mahabharata especially talks about Krishna Dvaipayana Vyas. Vyasa wrote it as per Mahabharata. One of the references states that when two sons of Vyas died, that is when he wrote the Mahabharata or the Jaya. So you see, this whole epic is a part of Vyasa being awakened about the truths of existence, about life and death, and all the moral values. And so he thought that I should compose an epic which tries to pass on these values. So that is when he wrote the Mahabharata, and it specifically is a composition by Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa. It is not by the Vyasa, which is referred, and there are, by the way, 28 Vyasas. Uh, Brahma himself is a Vyasa, and it goes from Brahma, the creator, up to Ashwatthama, which is going to be the next Vyasa as per the chronology. So it does not refer to the Vyasa because when you just say Vyas, it is simply a title. But Mahabharata is specifically a composition of Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa. That is what it is. So it is a particular entity and it is not a general entity.
ओके। और महाभारत एंड रामायण दोनों की फाइनल एडिटिंग कब हुई थी? क्योंकि ये 2-3 सेंचुरी में दोनों एक टेक्स्ट इवॉल्व करती गई, दोनों स्टोरीज इवॉल्व करती गई है। सबसे पहले कोड पार्ट था जया, फिर वो भारत बना, एंड देन फिर वो महाभारत बना। तो ये एक रफ आइडिया हमारे पास है क्या रिसर्च के बेसिस पे कि जया कब लिखी गई थी, एंड देन फाइनल एडिटिंग महाभारत की वो कब हुई थी?
Yes, so that is actually, you could say it is impossible to distinguish that this is where Jaya ends, this is where Bharata begins, this is where Mahabharata ends. It is all a part of the same epic. So we can no longer say which verses belonged to Jaya, like they were there in the original composition. But if you read the critical edition of Mahabharata by Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute, it actually, even for the Bhagavad Gita, they have selected only few verses which could be potentially the original Gita, as narrated by Krishna, as we see in the epic. So not all the verses that we know today as Bhagavad Gita are actually originally Gita. So yeah, there's also a distinction in that as well. And when you talk about that, when we see in the TV series, especially the Mahabharata TV series, so we see that it says that time stopped and all those things happen, magical things happen, and it gives a wrong picture to the Indian society when they see these epics on TV. It was not at all that. The entire Gita has been narrated by Krishna to Arjuna before the war started. So, for example, there were huge armies, Aukshahinis as we know them, and they were huge. So imagine if you have an army which has millions of people, how long should it take to get them into battle formations? It takes quite a long time to get them into battle formations. It is not just a task of, let's say, 5 minutes and it's done. No, it takes at least an hour to 2 hours to get these armies into battle formations. And that was precisely the time when Krishna narrated the entire Gita to Arjuna. So that is how it happened. It's not like the time was stopped and all the things stopped. No, not at all. It was basically an event which was before the war started. And during that time, all the armies were finally getting ready for the battle. So they were entering into battle formations. And during that time, just in that brief period, that is when Krishna narrated the Gita to Arjuna. And these are philosophical edicts, these are moral values. Krishna is trying to explain it to Arjuna. So it is more like a conversation, not like a narration or not like a recitation. It's a conversation between Krishna and Arjuna. So that's what Gita is. So that is the reason why we cannot really distinguish now linguistically between what came before, what came later. All these are suppositions, all these are speculations, but these speculations are agreed upon in the academic community. So that is why we believe that this should be the case. So that would be the indirect answer to your question.
एंड मैं इंद्र के बारे में बात करना चाहता हूँ, क्योंकि हमारे पास ये एक आइडिया है कि महाभारत पहले लिखी गई थी, एंड देन महाभारत में इंद्र अभी भी काफी पावरफुल है। पर देन हम रामायण की पीरियड में जाते हैं, वहां पे वो पावर उनका बहुत कम हो गया है। यहाँ पे एटलीस्ट इंद्र को डिफीट करना एक बिग फीट माना जाता है। एंड रामायण में कोई भी बड़ी बात नहीं है, इंद्र को डिफीट कर सकते हैं। देन पुराणाज में तो सभी लोग इंद्र को डिफीट कर देते हैं। तो यहाँ पे ये हम लोग को ट्रांजिशन मिलता है कि अब इंद्र का वैल्यू या फिर इंद्र का जो पावर है, स्टेटस एज अ गॉड, वो धीरे धीरे नीचे जाते जा रहा है।
Yes, definitely. So if you take the Vedic literature, Indra is very powerful. I mean, he defeated the Vritrasura, which is a snake, a giant snake, you can call it that, or a dragon, if you want to call it more, if you want to be more fantasy. But when he tries to defeat Vritra, he does that with a single smash. So that is how powerful he is. And Vritra is considered to be one of the strongest demons existing in the Vedic literature, and still he does that with a smash of his weapon, Vajra. So that is how powerful Indra is. You cannot defeat Indra in the Vedas. He is formidable. He's simply undefeatable. And then we slowly see that is why he's considered to be the supreme deity. And rather, he does not, he is not included in any of the categories of God. So there are three categories of deities in the Vedic literature. So the first ones are what we would call the elementals. The next ones are the personifications. And then Indra gets a class entire category of his own, and that is simply Indra. There's
हम्म
just one god in that category, and he's Indra. You cannot win. You cannot go on a battle against Indra and win. No, he's indefeatable. He's formidable. He's almighty. But then we slowly shift to the Puranas, and we see that the Puranic literature tries to kind of reject the ritualistic methods in the Vedas. It rejects the acceptance of elemental deities as a part of us. It says that no, this is not the way that we can understand nature. That is what the Puranic literature says. So it rejects the elemental deities and it concentrates or it brings the focus on the concept of a trinity, where we have Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. And so that is the reason why, maybe deliberately, they have shown Indra as weak, so that the people would not follow the elemental deities from the Vedic literature, and instead try to follow Shiva or Vishnu or Brahma. But not even Brahma, because there's a story in Purana which kind of says that you cannot worship Brahma because he was not honest in a competition between Vishnu and Brahma when they were trying to find the source of Shiva. So since Brahma is dishonest in that, he's cursed that nobody will, worship you. So there's no temple of Brahma. So even in that trinity, it is just the focus on Shiva and Vishnu. And all other deities are kind of implicitly dismissed. And Indra is dismissed the most in Puranic literature. He's shown as such a weak god that, people keep on, conquering him, subjugating his forces, getting the throne for themselves. That is not just the case in Vedas. In Vedas, he's formidable. So yes, we do see the shift in the power of Indra, in the acceptance of Indra as the Almighty God. So yes, there's a drastic shift from Vedic literature to Puranas. That's for sure.
और पुराना से पहले तो हरिवंश लिखी गई थी।
Hmm.
हम्म तो वहां पे इंद्र को लोग अभी भी वर्शिप कर रहे हैं, एंड देन वो शिफ्ट हो जाता है वो स्टोरी के साथ। सो अब मैं ये बात करना चाहूंगा, देवास कौन थे और असुरास कौन थे?
Okay, very good. So now here comes the trick, and here comes the place where you could relate it to the Indo-Iranian deities. So the Western academia and most of the academia in the world on Sanskrit literature believes that the Vedic literature originated in Central Asia, steppes, which we today refer to as, or as earlier folks, the Orientalists, they called it Aryan invasion. But for sure, we don't have any records or any evidence of an invasion. But linguistically, we do have a record of migration. So we cannot confidently deny that. We can confidently deny the Aryan invasion, but we cannot still confidently deny migration. Because we do see the Vedas themselves talk about the migration, and we see that the initial verses in the Vedas, especially Mandala 2, it was composed in Indo-Iranian era. It's a very earlier era. And so we have the parallel between the Vedic deities and the Iranian deities. So what we refer to as Asura in the Vedic literature, it is identified as Ahura in Iran. I mean, the Iranian deities. So you see a parallel, even linguistically. And the supreme god in Iranian literature would be, I mean, the Iranian religious literature is Ahura Mazda. So Ahura and Asuras, they are actually the same thing. The only contrast here is that in Iran, the Ahuras are the good guys. And in Vedic literature, the Asuras are the bad guys. So we see that there might have been an ideological conflict between the Vedic literature and the Iranian beliefs, and they were trying to oppose each other's influence on their texts. So it's all a kind of a conflict between the ideologies. But Vedic literature just makes it more tough because sometimes Indra and Mitra and Varuna are also referred to as Asuras, and they are also referred to as Devas. So it's kind of difficult to make a distinction, but later in the later mandalas, we have explicit distinction that Devas are the good guys, Asuras are the bad guys. But in the earlier versions, we do not see that distinction because oftentimes we see that Indra and Mitra are cited as Asuras. So why would they do that if Asuras were bad? Because you clearly cannot portray Indra as bad, but it still does that in the earlier mandalas. And that is how it kind of establishes a parallel ideology to the Iranian deities. But the later mandalas or the later verses, they try to oppose the Iranian influence. So there might be an ideological conflict during that time, where the Vedic literature is now trying to oppose all the Iranian influence. So for Vedas, the Asuras were the bad guys, whereas for the Indo-Iranians, the Ahuras, they were the good guys. So this is quite interesting to investigate, and this actually shows us the migration pattern linguistically. And this is something that people are trying to research further.
और वेदास में एक शिफ्ट भी है, आप नॉर्थ वेस्ट से आप ईस्टर्न साइड आप आते जा रहे हो, तो
Yes, right.
आप इसके बारे में कुछ बताओ.
Oh, yes, sure. So when you see the composition, the earliest composition took place in northwest region, and that's basically the lower region of Central Asia, the steppes. And from that, we see that the Vedic center shifts to the Kuru Rashtra. The Kurus become dominant around 1000 BCE. So we see the shift of Vedic, or rather, we see the shift in the Vedic center to Kuru Rashtra. But earlier, it was in the northwestern parts because we see the rivers which are mentioned. They actually mention the rivers in Afghanistan. And then later, they talk about Ganga, Sindhu, Saraswati, and all these rivers, which are a part of Indian subcontinent. So yes, we definitely see that shift from northwest towards the central India. You could say not central India, particularly Kuru Rashtra, and it has been highlighted many times. So there are tribes in Rigveda like Druyus, Dasyus, Ajas, and then there's Puru, and so there's an entire battle of 10 kings called as Dasharajana in Rigveda, and that talks about the 10 tribes which existed during the time of Rigveda. And all those tribes accept the dominance or the hegemony of the Kuru Rashtra. So yes, we do see this. We do see the shift in composition from northwest to Kuru. So that is why I made that slide in my post.
एंड हु वेयर द भरतास जो कि ये बैटल को जीतते हैं, बैटल ऑफ 10 किंग, एंड इन्हीं का जो जनरेशन होती है, लेटर जनरेशन, वही स्पॉन्सर करती है वेदास के कंपाइलेशन को.
Yes, that's true. So partially, if you take a look at the Dasharajana, it was indeed won by the Bharata tribe, to which the king Sudas belonged to. He's kind of a protagonist of the story, and he belongs to the Bharata tribe. But Puru are also equally powerful in that tribe. I mean, in that entire war. And yes, so the Bharatas, you could say they were the descendants, and they form the part of the most, you could say, that is where the lineage or the genealogy of the Vedic tribes begin. The Bharatas, Purus, Kurus, and all those tribes. These were the fundamental Vedic tribes, which are mentioned in the Rig Veda and also in the later Veda. And so you could say those were the founding fathers of the Indian subcontinent, or especially the ancestral North Indians, ANI, which we refer to today. Whereas the South Indians, we refer to them as ASI, ancestral South Indians. So even genetically, there is a difference between ANI and ASI. But basically, the Bharata tribe, you would call them the founding fathers, along with the other tribes, the founding fathers of the ancestral North Indian gene pool. That is what the Bharatas are. And since they won the battle, they took the charge of compiling the Vedic literature. into codified laws. And that is why they were the ones who created all the 10 mandalas in the textual form. And around 1000 BC, that is how it has been passed on since then. So those were the Bharatas.
एंड भरतास तो पुरु की सब ट्राइब थी ना?
Yeah, so it's really kind of difficult to differentiate between that because, as I said earlier, um, these are poems basically. So when you try to define that, sometimes it shows that Bharatas are higher in the hierarchy. Sometimes it shows that no, Purus are higher. Sometimes it shows no, Purus are higher. So it's basically to which tribe you belong to. Even the sages or the Vedic poets, they belonged to certain tribes. And the books, the mandalas, all of them, they are basically written by poets, kavis. Um, there is also a mention of the word Vipra, Brahmana, Kavi, and many other terms for the poets. And all of them belong to certain tribes. So obviously, if I'm patriotic towards my tribe, I'm going to display that as the dominant force. It is being nationalistic, but not towards the nation, towards the tribe. So that's how it happened in the Rigveda. So it's not really certain who was more powerful, who was more superior, who was higher in the hierarchy. But yeah, most of the references are like this. They are kind of mixed, we could say.
और ये मेरा एक पर्सनल प्रॉब्लम है। मैंने रामायण पढ़ ली क्योंकि वो सिर्फ 3 बुक थी। तो
Okay.
उस टाइम में अभी से ऑलमोस्ट 2000 ईयर पहले इतनी मोटी बुक लिखने की क्या जरूरत थी?
Very good question. So, as I said earlier, let me ask you a question to answer this question. What do you think, as an opinion, what do you think Ramayana is? What do you think?
ये स्टोरी अबाउट राम।
Okay, but do you think it is a historical narrative or is it simply a retelling of a historical, like, is it really a record of history or is it simply a retelling of the actual events?
आई डोंट नो इफ दैट इवेंट एक्चुअली हैपेंड, बट ये हिस्ट्री नहीं है, ये डिटेलिंग एक तरह से बोल सकते हैं, मिथ।
Yes, yes, that's true. But when you say that, many of the people suddenly they kind of revolt against the idea that no, how can you say this? Ramayana really happened. And while I partially agree on that, there might have been such a war. There might have been a king called Rama, Sita, Ravana. But when you think about that, there are more than 15 versions of Ramayana. Valmiki Ramayana is one of them. It's the foundation, is the source. But if you take a look at the Ramayana from the other sources, which we cannot deny because they are also a part of the Indian subcontinent. So there is a Ramayana in the Buddhist literature, there is a Ramayana in the Jaina literature. In fact, in the Jaina literature, in one section, um, Jaina literature explicitly says that it is not Rama who killed Ravana, it is Lakshmana who kills Ravana. And Jaina literature says that there is always a Vasudeva and Prati Vasudeva, and they kind of keep on, reincarnating in every age to take humanity towards the right path. So that is why Rama is identified as the Baladeva, Lakshmana is identified as the Vasudeva, and Ravana is identified as the Prati Vasudeva, the opposite of Vasudeva. So Rama does not kill Ravana because he's identified as one of the, he's not a Tirthankar, but he's at the range, he's at the level of Tirthankar. So he cannot commit Hinsa because Jaina builds on ahimsa. So how can the main character commit Hinsa? So he does not kill Ravana. Rama does not kill Ravana. Lakshmana kills Ravana in Jaina. And in Buddhist literature, especially in the Jataka tales, there is no record of this entire episode of Sita Apahara. It does not even mention about that. So this is another interesting thing. So yes, Ramayana is basically a didactic epic. That is what Ramayana is. And the reason for writing this is to pass on the values like morality, compassion, justice, codes of conduct. What would you call dharma? How should you perceive dharma? What is dharma? All these questions are answered in the form of an epic, in the form of a story, where we have a protagonist and he undergoes all these obstacles or these challenges just as an ordinary human would do. And if you actually read Valmiki Ramayana, Rama himself, he's oblivious to him being an avatar of Vishnu. He does not know that. He comes to know that in the last few verses, not verses, last chapters, last kanda of Ramayana. That is when he comes to know that he's actually an avatar of Vishnu. But to begin with, he just thinks of himself as any other human being. And that is very important. That is crucial because that teaches us that the entire journey, Ramayana literally means Rama's journey, Ayana is journey. So the journey of Rama is very much based on human values and it is based on acceptance. Rama teaches us to accept things as they are and to survive through them, to always find a solution. Rama, in my opinion, as a character, was a survivor. He had so many obstacles in his life. And if you really think about it, Rama's life is kind of depressing because
हाँ.
imagine, just imagine, I mean, are crowned, you are a crown prince, and when you actually are going to be coronated as the king, that is when you have to go for 14-year exile along with your wife. And you have to obey that because you are a man of your word. So he goes to exile for 14 years, and in the last few years, his wife gets kidnapped. So it's not like he can return now. He has to get his wife back. And where is she? She's way away from the Indian subcontinent. She's in Sri Lanka, if we accept Lanka as Sri Lanka. There are debates on that, but let's not get there. So yeah, he has to travel the entire subcontinent. He crosses an ocean, he rescues his wife, and then he comes back. And even after he comes back, there's an entire episode in Uttarakhand, which is sometimes not considered as part of the Ramayana because it is not there in Valmiki Ramayana. But of course, it's an addition, but it's still part of the epic. So in Uttaramayana, we see that again Sita has to go away. So even then, he does not reunite with Sita, and all sorts of things happen. So his life is really depressing, but still he teaches us that no matter how depressing your life is, you can still find a solution. Accept the reality and find a solution. That is the ethos of Ramayana. That is what Ramayana teaches us. And that is exactly why it was necessary to write that epic to show the people that yes, in spite of having so many obstacles, you can still choose the path of righteousness. You can still choose to be good. And that is what Rama as a character represents. That is beautiful if you think about
एंड रामायण अभी भी जो उसकी ट्रांसलेशन है वो सिर्फ 3 बुक है, पर
it.
महाभारत के साथ
Exactly.
10 बुक्स हैं. मैं रामायण को एटलीस्ट अगर ओवर पावर कर लूँ अपनी रीडिंग हैबिट को तो मैं 1 महीने में पढ़ सकता हूँ. बट महाभारत इज ह्यूज. 10 बुक्स, ऑलमोस्ट 5,000 पेजेस. तो इतनी लंबी बुक 2000 साल 2300 साल पहले क्यों लिखी गई और इसको मेंटेन कैसे करते थे, क्योंकि ये बहुत ज्यादा हो गया. 100,000
Yeah,
वर्स और
that's true.
75,000 बहुत बहुत ज्यादा हो गया.
Yes, that's true. So if you think about it, it is not unique to the Indian subcontinent or the Indic culture to write books or to preserve books or to write such huge compendiums. It is also there in the Greek culture. So if you think about that, the Greeks have their own epics, Iliad and Odyssey, where we written by or attributed to Homer. We are not sure if Homer really wrote those epics, but there are also Greek epics, especially the Iliad and Odyssey. And even those epics, they were actually transmitted in the form of an oral tradition. They were not written down, they were transmitted orally, just as Ramayana and Mahabharata were transmitted orally initially, and then they were written down. And in the Greek, the people who recited these epics, they were called rhapsodes. That is where the term rhapsody comes from. If you have heard the song Bohemian Rhapsody, that's where the term comes from, rhapsodes. It comes from the Greek people who were passing on the tradition orally, rhapsodes. And then it was textualized. And when you come to Mahabharata, there are certain elements which, when you read any epic, take any epic in the world, ancient epic, it definitely has 4 elements. And what are those 4 elements? What is the need to write this epic? And the reason is fourfold, if you want to call it that. The first is the epic has mimetic elements. So what is mimetic? Mimetic comes from the word mimesis. And if you compare that word, you remember the word mimic. Mimic is to mimic the reality. So these epics were actually written in a fashion which mimics the real world. And they are written in such ingenious form that when you read them, it's as if you are there. That's the brilliance of the writer. So they were written in a mimetic form. Mimesis. It expounds on mimesis. That is the first element. That when you read that, you almost feel that, okay, I am there. I feel the pain of Sita. I feel the pain of Ram. I feel the insecurity of Dhritarashtra. I feel the envy of Duryodhana, and I feel the envy of Karna. That is because they are written in such a form that people would experience all those emotions that the characters experience. That is mimesis. Second is catharsis. So catharsis is basically cleansing. So when you read those epics, for example, particularly the example of Draupadi Vastraharan. So a question for you is, when you read that event, what does it make you wonder about the definition of dharma? What does it tell you when you read the event of Draupadi Vastraharan?
वो तो एब्सोल्यूट अधर्म था.
Right? Yeah, that's true. But so my question is, Duryodhana was committing the adharma, which even on the grounds of humanity itself is wrong. But then we have so many people, like for example, we have Bhishma, we have Dronacharya, who are sitting there and still they're doing nothing. And why don't they do anything at all? Why do you think?
आई थिंक उनका जो धर्म का अंडरस्टैंडिंग था वो फ्लॉट था इसलिए.
Perfect, perfect. So what the epic here is trying to convey implicitly is that dharma is not orthodox, right? It is not orthodox. It is not just following promises. That's not what dharma is. So that particular event gives you a mental cleansing. It gives you a philosophical cleansing that dharma is not this. And if your dharma tells you not to protect a woman when she is being clearly, vastraharan is happening, and still you're not interfering because simply you are stuck on those orthodox beliefs. That is not what dharma is. So this particular event offers you a catharsis, a cleansing, a mental cleansing. That this is not dharma. What Krishna is doing, that is dharma. So Mahabharata expands on the second point, that is catharsis, cleansing. And then we, of course, have the ethos. So every story, every ancient epic has a strong ethos. And ethos means the morals that the story has. And the ethos of Mahabharata is, of course, the Bhagavad Gita. So the reason why Mahabharata was written is that it has a plethora of characters, plethora, a myriad of personalities. We have Dhritarashtra, which is insecure. We have Duryodhana, which is angry or which is envious of his brothers. We have Yudhishthira, who is very righteous. We have Arjuna, who is very determined and who is, of course, good, who is righteous. We have Bhima, which is strong. So all kinds of personalities are explored in Mahabharata. And then the Mahabharata expands on the behavior or the behavioral aspects of those personalities. So at the foundation, it is much more than just an epic. It is more like a pedagogical and didactic tale, which expands on phronesis, catharsis, mimesis, ethos, mythos, multiple elements. And it is ingenious in that form. And it is one of the most, you could say, brilliant epics ever written, the Mahabharata. So that's why it is very important. It passes on values to the next human generation. And by reading those characters, it gives us catharsis that, okay, this is not the correct path. I should not be like Karna. I should not be like Duryodhana. I should be like Arjuna, or I should be like Krishna. That is why they were written, to pass on moral values. That would be my conclusion.
एंड ये सभी कैरेक्टर बहुत ग्रे में आते हैं क्योंकि दुर्योधन भी हाफ द टाइम सुयोधना के नाम से रिफर किया जाता है.
Exactly, perfect. So that's another thing, as I said earlier. So the characters are not fixed. They are portrayed in the shades of gray, as you correctly pointed out. But in the Ramayana, we don't have that. Rama, no matter what you do, he is white. White in the sense he is always good, no matter what happens. Rama will always represent good. But when you shift to Mahabharata, you see the shift, more human aspect, where I could be good at times, but I could be bad at times. And that is more realistic because that's how humans are. So Mahabharata is more appealing to the human psyche than Ramayana is.
और रामायण के बारे में लोग अभी भी ये चीज नहीं समझते हैं कि जब राम को निकाला गया था वो वनवास सरवाइव करना वाज ऑलमोस्ट इम्पॉसिबल क्योंकि वो जंगल में जा रहे हैं. हमें पता है कि हाँ ठीक है वो गॉड है तो ही विल डिफीट रावण वेरी इजीली, वो आ जाएंगे वापस, हमें पता है. बट वहां पे वो जा रहे हैं, उनको वाल्मीकि रामायण में सभी को लग रहा है कि वो उनका रिटर्न ऑलमोस्ट इम्पॉसिबल है, नियर इम्पॉसिबल है. उनको खुद लगता है कि अब यहाँ पे द एंड है, बट फिर भी वो सरवाइव करते हैं सभी चीज को. सो ये ज्यादा ब्यूटी है स्टोरी का, जो कि गॉडली एलिमेंट के आने के बाद से आई थिंक बहुत ज्यादा वो करप्ट हो गया है.
Exactly. You just struck the right chord. So as I said earlier, don't just read the epic, be Rama in that epic. And now think about it. That okay, I'm a human and I was living in luxury in my palace, and suddenly I am exiled from my kingdom, and now I have to go into the forest. I have to renounce all my luxuries, which I have had since I was a child. Suddenly there is a shift from luxury to strenuous life, to arduous life. And so exactly when you follow Rama's journey by being Ram as a human, he does not know that he's an avatar. He tries to pursue this in every human way possible. So he had challenges. He might have had challenges finding food for everyday life. So try to think about it in terms of Rama, and then you will realize the real journey of Rama. And that is why the character is very human. He's less godly, he's less avataric, he's more human. And that is something that is admirable about the epic. That's true.
एंड जब वो पैलेस में भी थे तो उनका लाइफ कुछ इजी नहीं था, क्योंकि उनके फादर उनको एक दो डीमंस या राक्षस को मारने के लिए भेज रहे हैं जो कि बहुत ज्यादा पावरफुल हैं। एंड वहां पे भी सबको लगता है कि ही विल नॉट सर्वाइव दिस बैटल, क्योंकि वो 16 साल या 17 साल का है उस टाइम में। एंड जाना और कोई रियल लाइफ एक्सपीरियंस नहीं, और तुम जाकर के फेस करोगे टू मोस्ट पावरफुल डीमन और राक्षस उस टाइम के, और उनको फेस करके डिफीट करना बिना आर्मी के, सिर्फ अकेले जाना एंड देन डिफीट करना, सरवाइव करना, इट वाज अ नियर इम्पॉसिबल टास्क। तो उनका पैलेस में भी रहना वाज नॉट कि हाँ इजी लाइफ है बहुत ज्यादा।
Yes, exactly. That's true. So that again shows us the other side of Rama, where he's simply a human who's trying to, become someone. He's trying to find who he is, and so he has to go through all the things that every crown prince has to go through. So yes, we do see this journey, and it is very much human, and it is less godly. It is more human, as I said earlier. So yes, that does expand on the same idea which you have represented.
ओके, सो नाउ वी हैव रीच्ड द वेरी एंड ऑफ दिस एपिसोड। ये एपिसोड और भी लंबा होने वाला था, बट हमारी ओरिजिनल प्लानिंग थी कि हम वैदिक रिलीजन और हिंदुइज्म दोनों को डिस्कस करें एक ही एपिसोड में। बट वैदिक रिलीजन को डिस्कस करना, पोइट्री को डिस्कस करना इतना ज़्यादा इंटरेस्टिंग है कि हमने 1 आवर एंड 10 मिनट सिर्फ इसी को डिस्कस करने में निकाल दिया। तो नेक्स्ट एपिसोड में हम हिंदुइज्म को, उसके कोर प्रिंसिपल को, रूट ऑफ मॉडर्न हिंदुइज्म को, पुरानिक लिटरेचर को, इन सभी को डिस्कस करेंगे नेक्स्ट एपिसोड में। थैंक यू सो मच भार्गव फॉर डूइंग व्हाट यू डू। आपका जो वर्क है सत्यलोक पे, प्रोजेक्ट सत्यलोक पे, बहुत ज़्यादा अच्छा है, और उसी से मैं बहुत सारी इन्फॉर्मेशन सीखता हूँ। बहुत ही इजीली मैं डाइजेस्ट कर सकता हूँ इन्फॉर्मेशन। मुझे रिसर्च पेपर पढ़ने की ज़रूरत नहीं होती, मुझे मोटी मोटी बुक्स पढ़ने की ज़रूरत नहीं होती। एंड आई होप कि इस साल मैं अपना एक ड्रीम फिनिश कर लूंगा, इस साल मैं महाभारत पढ़ लूंगा। बहुत हेक्टिक है पढ़ना, 10-10 बुक है। और मेरे अंदर ये प्रॉब्लम क्या है ना कि अगर मैं कोई एक चीज़ करना हो तो मुझे उसी चीज़ को करना होगा। तो अगर मैं महाभारत पढ़ना हो तो मैं बीच में कोई और बुक पढ़ूंगा नहीं। एंड महाभारत 10 बुक है, ऑलमोस्ट 5,000 पेज, तो एटलीस्ट 6 मंथ लगेगा एटलीस्ट। So thank you so much for coming to this show and explaining the Vedic religion, the poetry, the Vedas, and the Itihasas. So thank you so much. And
Yeah, you're welcome, and it was my pleasure to talk about it.
yeah, thank you. And we will talk about Hinduism in the next episode. So तभी तक के लिए इस एपिसोड को लाइक करें, शेयर करें। बहुत ज़्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट है शेयर करना और कमेंट करना, क्योंकि एकेडमिक इंफॉर्मेशन वैदिक रिलीजन का या फिर हिंदुइज्म का हमारे अभी के टाइम में बहुत ज़्यादा कम है। लोग एकेडमिक स्टडी बिल्कुल पढ़ना नहीं चाहते हैं, सभी को वो रिलीजियस पर्सपेक्टिव से हिंदुइज्म को देखते हैं। तो ये बहुत ज़्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट है कि हम एकेडमिकली देखें एक्चुअल में क्या था, पोइट्री को पढ़ें, ऑब्जेक्टिवली पढ़ें, बहुत ज़्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट है। सो प्लीज़ लाइक दिस एपिसोड, प्लीज़ कमेंट ऑन दिस एपिसोड, एंड प्लीज़ 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 शेयर दिस एपिसोड, क्योंकि एक एक एपिसोड में जितनी इन्फॉर्मेशन हम डाले हैं उसको अ, एक प्रॉपर फॉर्मेट में डालने में हमें बहुत ज़्यादा टाइम लगता है। मैं ये बोल रहा हूँ क्योंकि मैंने खुद रामायण पढ़ा है, और सिर्फ वो 2-3 चीज़ों को जानना कि उनके लिए जाना वनवास में सुसाइडल था, दोनों बैट दोनों असुरास, दोनों डीमंस को फाइट करना सुसाइडल था। ये सिर्फ एक छोटी से छोटी इन्फॉर्मेशन को पढ़ने के लिए, इसको जानने के लिए मुझे पूरी बुक पढ़नी पड़ी, और मुझे 1.5 मंथ लग गया था। और भार्गव को एटलीस्ट 2 से 3 साल लगा होगा जितना इन्फॉर्मेशन उन्हें हमें आज इस एक एपिसोड में दिया। सो प्लीज
Yeah.
शेयर दिस एपिसोड, ये बहुत ज्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट है। एंड यूज दिस एपिसोड एज अ रेफरेंस पॉइंट इफ यू वांट टू। एंड वी विल टॉक अबाउट हिंदुइज्म इन द नेक्स्ट एपिसोड। सो टिल देन, बाय।